Well, good afternoon, everyone. About to start this week's Future Trends Forum. I'm delighted to see you all here today. We have a fantastic guest who has written a powerful book on, of course, a great topic. I'm absolutely delighted to host someone who has a wonderful first name, although it has an unfortunate typographical error in it. We've been talking about actually institutional change since we launched the forum back in 2016. We've approached it from a wide range of angles. We've tried to figure out how change can appear sociologically, politically, pressures from the inside and pressures from the outside. But this is the first book that we've really looked into that focuses on the resistance to change within higher education. It has a fantastic title called Whatever It Is, I'm Against It, after the great Marx Brothers film. And I'd like to welcome our guest, who is, among other things, a former president, a professor of British literature, and just a wonderful, thought-provoking person. So without any further ado, let me bring him up on stage. Good afternoon, Brian.
Hello, Brian, with a Y. And let me begin, first of all, by apologizing for the strange and floral background. I am in the Graduate Hotel in Palo Alto, California, and this is where the best light is. So it looks very homey.
Well, I appreciate you attending to the best light for video. That means a great deal. I should ask this, knowing full well I'll probably cringe at the result. How is Palo Alto today?
72 and sunny.
Yeah, all right. I'm cringing already. It sounds rough. I hope you can endure the suffering and the struggle.
I will try.
Listen, we have a tradition here of asking people to introduce themselves in an unusual way. Rather than asking about your biography, we ask about what you're doing in the next year. What are the topics and projects that are top of mind for you?
So I will be flying directly on Saturday from Palo Alto to Kigali, Rwanda, where I am working with a startup institution, the African Leadership University. I've been working as an advisor there for almost 3 years, and now I've also joined the board. And I have to say the most exciting work for me over the next year is to continue to try to build a startup university in the most underserved and youngest continent in the world. It is both very difficult and extraordinarily interesting. So I'm doing some other things, but that's the thing right now that for me is definitely top of mind.
Oh, that's fantastic. What a terrific experience. What a great amount of learning. In fact, in the last chapter of this book, I'm just going to wave this around a few more times, in part because it has a fantastic cover, but also if you'd like to grab a copy, just look in the bottom left corner of your screen. There's a kind of tan colored button. If you click that, that'll take you to a web page for getting more information about the book. The last chapter spends a good amount of time learning from the experience of ALU. Which I thought was very, very impressive. And are you teaching at Harvard? I know you're glad to have finally landed there, but do you have any responsibilities to students?
I do. I teach the master's students in the Graduate School of Education, and I teach both the in-person students, and there's an online program which is really interesting. So I do about a course and a half a year. I'm doing a January term course for the online students, and then I'm doing an in-person course for the students on campus. And the course that I've taught most often is entitled, appropriately these days, I think, Ethical Questions in Higher Education. And as you know, Brian, there is no shortage of those questions right now.
Quite true. Well, I'm excited for your students. I know they're going to have a great amount of learning and a great time, and I really look forward to learning about the progress of ALU, especially in this turbulent year. I've got to say, your book was both incredibly funny throughout. The title gave me a hint, but you have a wonderful wry sense of humor that almost hits Dickensian levels appropriately at times. But if you haven't had a chance to read it, this goes through a series of domains wherein one can find resistance to change in higher education. And they start off with institutional reputation, with the incentives given both to individuals as well as to organizations, the power of academic disciplines, especially departments, the question of how to structure shared governance and what it actually manages to accomplish, and then the role that tenure plays for those that actually have tenure or are on the tenure track. And I'm there's so many great insights here. I would love to have assigned this to some of my students, but you have lots and lots of points where you come back to this observation that the modern university or college seems to be beautifully designed to resist change at all costs. That there's this whole series of overlapping structures that make it conservative in an institutional sense, not in a political sense. I'm wondering if you could just start from there. I mean, what was that like to realize this as a president, and how do you think we got to this place?
Brian, it's been a paradox that I've wrestled with for a large portion of my career. And by the way, I enrolled as a first-year student at Cornell University in the fall of 1973. So I've been within the world of higher education for a half century, as a student and as a faculty member, as dean, as a president. And one of the questions that I've always been puzzled by is how can it be that this industry that is populated by so many people who think of themselves as very progressive and advocate for political and social change, who within their own disciplines are constantly pushing the boundaries of knowledge and pushing for change, how can it be that they inhabit and create institutions that actually change very little? And what it led me to think about was a set of cultural and structural reasons. I don't think you can point finger at individuals. I think people who go into higher education want to do a good job. I think it's true of faculty. I think it's true of staff, of administrators. And so I think it's not a desire not to do a good job. And when it's not something that is dependent upon individuals, I tend to look at culture and its structures. And once I had some time to think after I stepped away from a college presidency in the spring of 2020, the first pandemic spring, I really had the luxury to step outside of that bubble and look at it, to look at the startup of a university outside a U.S. context, to teach about higher education. And all those things led me to what I believe are a set of, again, cultural and structural reasons why this wonderful industry where I've spent my life just doesn't seem capable of changing in ways beyond the incremental, despite all the challenges that it faces.
That's a beautiful phrase, which I just shared out about faculty who are so radical, innovative, progressive in their politics and in their research, inhabit these institutions that are at this stage so extraordinarily conservative. In the chat, Peter Shea says faculty are often politically progressive and pedagogically conservative. They want to change every part of the world except their own, which I thought was quite pithy. Mm-hmm. Well, let's break this down to some of the details. I was really struck by the chapter on academic disciplines, which I read as really being about departments, and you found that again and again, you might have an institution-wide desire to accomplish something, and it would run smack into a department, which would end up thwarting the change successfully, or there would be a change that would come from elsewhere, and again, departments would do that. You write that faculty tend to see themselves as part of disciplines first and foremost. So I am a French historian before I am a professor at Macalester. And at the end of the book, you recommend that we rethink this. You say that ALU, you don't have that strict adhesion quite as much. And you go through some options for, if not dismantling departments, for coming up with other ways of organization, but you seem a little bit pessimistic about that. I mean, are disciplines basically here to stay? Are they the firewalls that we've built in for the long term?
I never want to say never, but I think when you have, a legacy industry with very intense in entrenched structures, most people who study change, and you're one of the people who studies change, know that it's very hard to change those industries from within. If I were king of higher education and I could do one thing, I'd probably start with graduate education.
Hmm.
The degree that is dominant in American higher education is the PhD. And when we think about the way PhDs are trained, certainly when I think about my own PhD training, uh, it was very siloed. I was trained to be an English professor. Not only an English professor, I was trained in 19th century British literature and Victorian literature. And not only did I have very little contact with departments outside the English department, I didn't even have that much contact with people who were studying American literature. And so I think that the faculty who come into colleges and universities are trained to think of themselves essentially as members of a guild, as members of a professional guild. That's where their allegiance lies. That's where their colleagues exist. And they're not trained at all to think about what it means to be in a college. Most of them are not going to go into institutions that resemble the institutions at which they were trained. Uh, they're going to go into community colleges and state colleges and small private colleges.
Mhm.
And wouldn't it be great if graduate education included some education in how those institutions worked and what their economics were like, what the pressures on them were like? Wouldn't it be great if graduate education included more emphasis on teaching and
Mhm.
pedagogy,
Mhm.
rather than simply having graduate students being thrown into the deep end of the pool? So I think it begins with the way academics are trained and acculturated. And so I think in many ways, by the time they get to a tenure track or even an NTT position, they've already been trained in a particular way and to think in a particular way. So I think ideally, I would redo graduate education. To, First of all, because most of those students, or many of those students in disciplines like my own English, are not going to end up in academia. But second of all, if they do, I would love it if they had a more detailed understanding of what an endowment was, and what a board of trustees is, and how governance actually works at these institutions, and what students actually need, as opposed to a detailed understanding just of the minutia of the life of Charles Dickens.
As delightful as that is, yeah, I agree. Would you also try to shrink the enrollment and some graduate programs, especially in the humanities and the social sciences?
Lenny Cazuto has a great line in a book I really admire. It's entitled The Graduate School Mess, and you can tell from the title what it's about. And what Lenny says in that book is that, all over the country in the humanities, there are thousands of faculty training thousands of students for jobs that don't exist. And it seems to me that there's a real ethical question that lies at the heart of that. We know why the graduate students are brought in. Graduate students are the engine that allow the research university to run. They provide much less expensive teaching than full-time faculty members do. They provide graduate assistance. They allow faculty to teach graduate classes. And so universities are incentivized to admit lots and lots of graduate students. But when you're admitting students at a rate that is not in any way proportionate to the jobs that they will be able to get, it seems to me that there is something of an ethical problem there. There was a highly publicized study at my graduate alma mater, Columbia University, a few years ago. One graduating member of the PhD class got a tenure track job, and 19 new students were admitted. That seems to me problematic. And if you look at the websites of these graduate departments, try to find information about job placement. It's
Yeah.
very sketchy. It's not there. And so probably in some disciplines, it would make sense and be more responsible to have smaller graduate programs.
Well, thank you. Thank you for that heartfelt answer. I had similar experience, by the way, University of Michigan graduate, and didn't learn anything about how to run a university, much less a college oriented teaching. Let me step out of the way. My job here is to facilitate your questions. So as you've got comments, as you have questions that you'd like to put to President Rosenberg, please just click the raise hand button if you want to join us on stage. You can tell you don't have to have a beard to be on stage, although it might help. And just hit the Q&A box with your own questions. And we already have one of them from our good friend Keel Dumsch. And Keel asks this. Higher ed has little reason to change because its main product, degrees, is mandated by employers. I would like Brian's view on the potential of alternative credentials to force change.
So that's a terrific question. And it is, in fact, the case that in many ways, the foundation that's sustaining higher education in the United States is the fact that a college degree remains the main entryway into the majority of well-paying jobs. Not all of them, but the majority of them. And as long as that remains the case, higher education is going to have some sort of a guaranteed market. You need to pass through this door to get the golden ticket to move into the workforce. But if that changes in a serious way, and we are beginning to see that, I think there are somewhere between 15 and 20 states now that have announced that they're no longer going to require a college degree for a lot of public positions. The state of Minnesota just announced that a couple of days ago, and it will affect about 2/3 of the positions that they hire. And so if employers, public or private, start to move away from this notion that what's required in order to get hired is a bachelor's degree or a master's degree, and instead a particular set of skills, then it will probably place more pressure on higher education than anything that we have seen so far. There are some indications that is beginning to happen. One of the reasons it's beginning to happen is that if you look at a state like Minnesota, there's a dramatic shortage of college-educated workers to fuel a knowledge economy. And so employers need to think about other ways of filling those positions beyond the requirement of a bachelor's degree. So higher education is highly dependent upon that recognition by employers. If employers start to change, it could add to a multiple set of pressures that are already being brought to bear on the sector. And it's hard to predict the future. You're a futurist. I'm not. But I think there's a greater than minimal chance that might happen.
Greater than minimal. Okay. Well, first of all, that's a great question, Keel, and thank you for asking that. Keel, this has been something that Keel's been researching and focusing on for years, and he's superb at this. Friends, if you're new to the Future Trends Forum, that's an example of a text question. So you can follow Keel's path and just type into the Q&A box, type in your question. And before I can even finish saying that sentence, Brian, a whole bunch of questions have come up. This is one from our excellent friend, Steve Ehrman, who's a guest once, who has written a very, very powerful book on institutional change. And Steve asks, how do the economics of higher ed influence resistance to or the championing of institutional change?
So I make a lot of arguments in the book about why higher education needs more than incremental change, and most of them certainly can be debated. The one that I think it's impossible to debate is the economic argument. The average discount rate now at private colleges and universities across the United States is 56%. And it is going up every year, not by 1/10 of a point or 2/10 of a point, but by 2 or 3 percentage points. When I began my presidency at Macalester, that number was closer to 40%. And so what that means is essentially that private higher education in the United States is on sale for more than half off. And that discount and its trajectory is the definition of economic unsustainability. Sooner or later, you're going to get to the point where the discount rate is 100% and you're giving it away for free. And obviously, that's impossible to do. And so the one thing that it seems to me higher education cannot do is argue that it is sitting on a sustainable financial model. And when you combine that with demographic trends and the fact that, to use a phrase that many people use, that we're headed for a demographic cliff, where there's going to be about a 15% decline in the number of high school graduates in the United States in the second half of this decade. You're looking at a situation where there just aren't enough students who are willing to pay and able to pay enough money to enroll in most colleges in the United States. There's a small group that is very economically secure. It might be generous to say that the number is 100. There are 4,000 colleges and universities in the United States. And so sooner or later, I think that economic argument and the pressures it's going to bring to bear on colleges and universities is going to, I would assume, create enough pressure to force more change. I have been surprised by the amount of resistance to change, even at institutions that are facing closure. But one would think that given the choice between closing and changing, some institutions will decide to change in more than incremental ways. But I think, to me, the economic argument is the one that it is hardest to dismiss, because the model, look, I love higher education. I love what goes on at a place like Macalester. If I could recreate a Macalester experience for every student in the United States and every student in the world, I would do it in a heartbeat. Macalester's comprehensive fee is between $70,000 and $80,000. And that's pretty close to what it costs per student to produce that education. The reality is that's a luxury good. It's not scalable. It's not available and accessible to most students. So much as I might like that model, we have to think about other models if we're going to reach the students that we are not reaching now, and if we're going to create colleges and universities that are economically sustainable. So it's a long answer, but I think the economic pressure is probably the strongest of all the pressures that are being brought to bear right now in higher education.
And this is where your book begins, by addressing that. Steve quickly followed up with a clarifying question, which is, does the business model contribute to greater resistance to change?
Probably. First of all, most faculty at most institutions have very little understanding of the actual business model, I have found. And so they don't realize, for instance, that the amount of scholarship funding that you provide does relate to the amount of salary that you have available to your faculty and staff. But the business model of relying on a small number of revenue streams. I mean, college budgets are not complicated. The money comes from students. It comes from an endowment if you have it. It comes from public sources if you're a public institution, and it comes from fundraising. And there aren't a lot of levers left to pull in that particular set of revenue streams. And so unless higher education thinks about generating revenue in another way, it's also going to need to think about reducing costs.
Well, that is a perfect segue to the next question. I mean, this is scripted. It feels like it is so good, because my dear friend and teacher, Joellen Parker, has this to ask. Is Larry Bacow right? There is no natural constituency on campuses for reducing costs to students.
First of all, hi, Joellen. It's been a while since I've seen you. I think Larry is right, and in the chapter on incentives, I in the book, I address this. I mean, the reality is that there is no constituency at a college that has the power to affect change that is really incentivized to reduce costs. So just take the constituencies with the most influence. Faculty reducing costs typically means, and has to mean, probably doing the same thing with fewer people, because the budget at most colleges and universities is about 2/3 personnel costs. There's some variation, but you won't find a college or university that doesn't have compensation for employees as its greatest cost. So you're not going to reduce costs by eliminating climbing walls and by printing on 2 sides of paper. If you're going to reduce costs, you have to figure out how to do it with fewer people. And obviously the people who are employed there are not incentivized to do that. Students are not incentivized because they don't want less of stuff. Students typically want more of stuff. And the complaints that you typically get, that I would certainly typically get from students, were not about why we should be cutting something, but why didn't we have more of something? Administrators, presidents don't want to lose their jobs. And the quickest way to generate a vote of no confidence is to recommend cuts. And boards of trustees, they might make some noise about reducing costs, but typically they, for a whole variety of reasons, don't know enough about higher education, how higher education works, and aren't really engaged enough to press to reduce costs. So there really is no incentive within the institution to reduce costs or to change things in a dramatic way, and that is part of the problem. Change is hard. People don't like it, and typically, in order for there to be change, there needs to be some sort of pretty powerful extrinsic incentive, either a positive one, like getting a big raise, or a negative one, like, I better not touch that hot stove again. But where are the extrinsic incentives within higher education for any of these constituencies to reduce costs? They don't exist. Often until the point where the institution is in such peril that it's probably too late.
Joellen, thank you for that great question, which echoes our discussion last week. And thank you, Brian, for that very, very thoughtful and powerful answer. We have a question from a Mac alumnus. This is George Valencianos, who I believe is now a professor. I'm not sure where. And he asked a question about about institutional change. I graduated from Mac in 2004. We didn't have an LMS or online courses. Now they do. But that's not the change Brian is speaking about. I'd like to hear, what are the radical areas of change versus minutia?
Thank you, and nice to hear from a McAllister alum. So you're absolutely right. I mean, one of the responses I sometimes get to my book, and obviously the title is meant to be a deliberate exaggeration. Of course, there are changes that have taken place. When I started in higher education, I did not have a computer in my office. I thought it was a big deal to have a Selectric typewriter. So the technology has changed, and online delivery has come along, and there aren't too many more overhead projectors left. So there have been some changes, but they have been what I would describe as small, slow, incremental changes. What I would describe as more dramatic changes would be things like, and I talk about this in the book, the academic calendar. Take my own institution, McAllister. We essentially operate our main business for 2/3 of the year. We have a fall semester, then a long winter break, 4 to 5 weeks, a spring semester, and then a 3-month break. And during those 4 months when we're not operating, first of all, students aren't learning. And second of all, this super expensive physical plant is sitting essentially empty and unused. We have cheerleader camps and sports institutes. And meanwhile, it takes students 4 years of college time, tuition to graduate. And this is not a universal phenomenon, of course, around the globe. The ALU calendar is 3 years. There are the equivalent of 3 15-week terms each year, separated by 3-week breaks. And students graduate in less time, pay less tuition, and with less opportunity cost. And so why can't we look more seriously at the traditional academic calendar? As I say in the book, the simplest way to reduce the cost of a 4-year degree is make it a 3-year degree. And we could do that without very much difficulty if we were willing to take a serious look at the calendar. I would also take a serious look at a lot of the pedagogical models in higher education. Higher education still relies chiefly on a model that was developed in medieval universities. At a time when if you wanted to learn things, you needed to go to a physical place where there were smart, trained people, and this thing called a library, where there were these things called books. And these people would fill your head with knowledge. We live in a very, very different world right now, a world in which I have more access to information on my iPhone than you probably could get in the Harvard Library 50 years ago, where the ability of students to access information is almost unlimited, needs a lot of work in its curation, but is almost unlimited. We have learned through a lot of research that passive learning is not as effective as active learning. And so a question I would ask is, why are there still so many lectures? You know, there's a very, very smart guy at Harvard, Eric Mazur, he's a physicist, who has studied this a lot. And he said that, you know, the problem with the lecture is that it gives the faculty member the illusion of teaching and the student the illusion of learning. But the reality is that not as much of either is going on as people think. So given the cost of college, a question I would ask is, why are we still spending so much time with passive delivery of information that could be delivered less expensively and more efficiently in other ways? And why aren't we using the face-to-face time for different kinds of and higher levels of learning? I would make universities much, much less fragmented and siloed than they are now. Even small colleges with fewer than 1,000 students will often have 35 majors and 35 different departments. And it adds to cost, it doesn't benefit students, and it really doesn't do a very good job of preparing students for the world they're going to move into. So I think, why is it that every university essentially structures its curriculum in more or less the same way, which is you come in and you major in something? There are a handful of examples that are different, but they're only a handful. Wouldn't you think with 4,000 universities, there would be more different models of how students' education was structured? So these are the kinds of more dramatic changes that I think we at least need to talk about. You know, and one of the points that I try to make again and again is that I don't necessarily have all the answers, but we're not going to get to the answers unless we ask the questions. And it is really difficult in higher education even to ask these questions without getting enormous pushback.
That's and you begin your book with an example of that. And a liberal arts professor that I know actually wrote a long Substack about why that anecdote was the faculty were correct and why you were wrong, by the way, which is thank you for the question, by the way, and thank you for the great answer. I think we're really coming to an understanding here. We have a ton of questions coming up, Brian, and I want to make sure we can get to as many of these as possible. We have another one from a faculty member at a small liberal arts college. This is Professor Meredith Goldsmith at Ursinus College, where I bet autumn is quite lovely there right now. And she asks this: last week, James Schulman talked about professional societies as levers of change. Could organizations like MLA or AHA support change in graduate education? Do graduate departments have incentive to listen?
Yeah. First of all, I read James's new book, and we have a lot of areas of overlap. He has a different prescription, I think, than I do for how change might come about. But I think where our books are very similar is in the argument that higher education has been a very change resistant industry, and that he looks at it from a more sociological perspective. But we've talked, and our views are on that very much aligned. It's possible that those organizations could could push for change. In my experience, the one I know best is the MLA, since I was an English professor. Um, MLA is doesn't really have much agency when it comes to convincing departments to think about how they operate. So I'm a little bit less sanguine than James is about the potential for organizations like that to push for change. To go back to an earlier point, I think it's more likely to come if employers push for it. If employers say, English major, you're not preparing students with the skills and competencies that we need to hire them. And so maybe you ought to think about redoing or restructuring or reimagining your curriculum. So I haven't seen professional organizations produce a lot of change in higher ed, so I'm not sure that that's where it's going to come from.
Okay, that's a very good question, and I'm glad that you had a chance to read James's book, Brian. He was a terrific guest. We're going to have the program recording up pretty soon. We have another question really closely along those lines from Karen Belnier at Mitchell College, having to do with work and workforce. And she asks, what role do you see workforce development / non-credit learning playing in institutional budgeting? They are already a hidden cushion in many places. Could they become equal partners?
Certainly, I think there is the potential for, and there is a built-in incentive for many colleges and universities to think about providing credentials beyond the traditional associate or bachelor's or master's degree. When you look at, for instance, the demographic problem, one of the ways of addressing the decline in the number of 18 to 22-year-olds is to begin to try more seriously to educate what has usually been called the non-traditional student, but is increasingly becoming a very traditional kind of student. And that would mean changing the model. You're not going to get a working parent to show up on a campus and live in a residence hall and be in a classroom 5 days a week at 10 o'clock in the morning. And yet that's a market that both needs and in many cases desires various forms of education and training. Some of it very vocationally focused, some of it more intellectually focused. But if I were a college now looking at a problematic budget and problematic enrollment and demographics, I would be thinking about how to tap into some of those alternative markets, which would mean offering some of those what's sometimes called stackable credentials, alternative credentials. And I should just say, my argument is not that everyone should go to college. My argument about equity is that everyone who wants to go to college should be able to go to college. Right now, that's not the case. Right now, there are all kinds of built-in inequities into the system. So for many people, going to college or not is not a choice. I think it should be a choice for everyone. For some people, the right choice would be no college or an associate degree or vocational training. For some people, it would be a PhD. But we should live in a society where the choice is left with the individual and not dictated by your economic status or your race.
Well put. Very well put. I think this next question takes this in another direction that I think you might appreciate. This is Rajiv Jangani. He's Vice Provost of Teaching and Learning at Brock University. And he takes us back a couple of years. Reflecting on the pandemic, what do you think distinguishes colleges that leaned into the changes, e.g. online learning, remote work, from others that quickly reverted to pre-pandemic strategies?
I have been, and I did, again, talk about this a little bit in the book. It's been a little bit surprising and somewhat disappointing to see how quickly so many higher education institutions have just snapped back to what I would describe as the old normal.
Mm-hmm.
And I get it. In many cases, it's revenue driven.
Mm-hmm.
Colleges rely on room and board and on having students on campus. And it's hard to justify charging the same amount of money if students are not on campus. And so for many institutions, it's a budgetary problem to move to a different mode of delivery or a different model. But we really did learn things during the pandemic. At the university that I will be attending a conference at, Stanford, in the computer science department at Stanford, they made all kinds of changes during the pandemic to how they evaluated students, how they structured their classes, aside from just being online. And one of their members has written about the fact that as soon as the pandemic ended, they just dropped them all, and they went back to exactly the way they were. So the ones that I think are trying to take what they learned and use them tend to be the institutions that are under more financial pressure and are looking to move into areas like online education. The challenge is it's a big ocean, online education, and you're competing against some very large, very well-funded players in that world. And it is harder than people think to just break into it. But I think the most secure and traditional institutions, as far as I can see, have adopted very little of what they learned from the pandemic. But I think you are seeing some more struggling institutions trying to say, all right, we've learned something about, say, what does and does not work online. What the opportunities and challenges of a course on Zoom are. How can we use that to expand our revenue, expand our student body, expand our reach? But it's those who thought that the pandemic would result in a totally different version of higher education emerging on the other side of it probably would acknowledge now that that's not what's happened, at least so far.
Okay. Well, thank you. I feel much the same way. That snapback is something that has dispirited me. But the sheer amount of innovation that higher education expressed really does inspire me. We have, go ahead, please, sorry.
No, I was just going to say, it was amazing. One of the things we learned during the pandemic was that when there is no choice, higher education can be extraordinarily agile. That was a moment that many people thought would be cataclysmic for American higher education. And while it was really, really difficult, and I think without federal funding, a lot of institutions would have closed. The rapidity with which the entire industry, administrators, faculty, student affairs staff, pivoted and adapted to the changes forced by the pandemic was incredibly impressive. So that was a case where there was no choice. You couldn't just say, I'm going to teach my class the way I've always been teaching it, because the students weren't there. Yeah. So it is doable. It's just that when there's a choice, people tend not to make that choice.
So that's well said. That's very well said. Friends, we have about 9 minutes left. So I want to make sure we get as many of your questions as possible. And one of them comes from Brian Mulligan at Word Education Futures. And he asked about online scaling classes. Will degrees at scale put pressure on institutions? If Georgia Tech and others can provide at much lower cost, will that impact on colleges that cannot change?
Great question. Straightforward answer, yes. I think if institutions like that and other institutions with deep pockets and brand recognition decide that they want to move into either an online world or get substantially larger, absolutely it could. Look, the market is not getting bigger, it's getting smaller, the student market, of traditional students at least. And so if some of those institutions with resources and brand strength decide to flex those muscles, and to take more of those students, it could absolutely put even more pressure on other institutions that don't have those kinds of resources. You know, if I just look at the example of the Graduate School of Education at Harvard, during the pandemic, everything went online, and so for the entire first year that I was there, all the instruction was over Zoom. There wasn't a building open on campus, and what they realized was, because it's Harvard, students stayed. Students didn't go away. And so what did they do? They created an online program that is now permanent, in addition to the in-person program. So now there's an in-person Masters of Education at Harvard and an online Masters of Education at Harvard. And both are highly competitive. Now, there are a finite number of students who want to get a Master's in Education. If Harvard is introducing a new online program, clearly that's going to have an effect down the line on other programs that might be struggling for enrollment. And so I do think that, you know, it's not just the Southern New Hampshires and the Arizona states that are becoming very, very big, but I do think you might start to see some of these institutions realize that their brands are so impervious to disruption that they can move into online education and still maintain their reputation. And they have the money to innovate and to experiment, and a lot of institutions don't. So that could be another pressure.
Thank you. That's a great answer and a great question. And we have still more questions coming up. This is one from John Wesley Lowry at IUP. I don't want to summarize this. This is too good a question. In Inside Higher Ed, you identified shared governance as a barrier, while also calling for various groups to be included in higher education decision-making, such as students and adjuncts. How to do that without it? I think how to have that kind of decision-making shared governance.
Yeah, so it's a really great question, and it ties together a number of things that I've thought about and we talked about earlier. And it relates also to incentives. So, you know, shared governance is one of those terms, I think, that is widely used and used in very different ways and widely misunderstood. If you go back to the AAUP's formative statement on shared governance in 1966, it identifies three parties who participate in shared governance: the Board of Trustees, the President, and the faculty. And by faculty, they don't say specifically, but they clearly mean tenured and tenure-track faculty. So many people use shared governance to include students, NTT faculty, staff. The reality is that at most institutions, there are 3 points of power: the board, the president, the tenure-track faculty. And as we talked about earlier, none of those are really incentivized to push for more dramatic change. There are groups like NTT faculty and graduate students who are more incentivized, and a lot of staff who are more incentivized to change things. And so the point I make is that maybe if they had more of a voice, there'd be more of a push to change some practices than there is right now with those 3 groups. But having said that, I still think, and this is, look, I was determined when I wrote this book to be honest and to try to spark debate. Anyone who studies organizational change will tell you that consensus is the enemy of innovation. That almost by definition, if you're trying to push an idea that is truly innovative and disruptive, there are going to be some people who are very uncomfortable with it and resist it. And in the shared governance structure at most colleges and universities, any one of the parties in it has the ability to bring something to a stop. And it doesn't even have to be the entire group. You could have 2/3 of the faculty supporting something, but a very loud 1/3 that brings it to a stop. And so shared governance is a great system if you want stability and very slow change. And for much of higher ed's history, that's, I think, been appropriate. I think the question for everyone to think about is, is this current moment different? And is that governance structure as suited to this current moment as it might have been to a moment 50 years ago? My argument is that this moment is different, and I get it. That's been said for a long time. Clayton Christensen said it decades ago, and I was one of the people who was very, very skeptical of his notion of higher ed being dramatically disrupted. I still think he got some things wrong, but I would argue that the moment now, we are at a moment now of inflection, and that a system of governance that is designed to preserve stability is not particularly well suited to a moment that requires agility and change. Mm. And so what can we come up with that would allow voices to participate, but that wouldn't hold the whole process of change hostage to the people who are most resistant to change?
That's really, really well said. Thank you for the question, and Brian, thank you for that excellent answer. I'm going to take the moderator's privilege here and soak up the last 2 minutes with my own question, which is, if we look ahead 10 years, roughly where do you expect to see some institutions actually following your prescriptions and starting to change things up? Should we look for the entrance of another online mega university like Southern New Hampshire? Should we look to a couple of small liberal arts colleges? Should we perhaps look to the community college section, which tends to be much more flexible? I mean, where should we anticipate change in the face of such massive resistance?
I think in general, it's more likely to come from the bottom up than the top down. That is, I think, interesting. Look, obviously there's going to be a lot of pressure coming from the mega universities. There's probably going to be continued pressure from for-profits. I don't think the fact that they've been as largely ineffective as they've been up until now should guarantee that will continue to be the case. And so we know that it's going to come from there, but the change that I am most interested in and hope for most profoundly is change from within higher education, from a nonprofit sector, by people who really care about the social mission of higher education. And I think that's likely to come from institutions that are faced with, what biologists would call the, adapt or die problem, right? You either adapt or you go away. And then also from potentially outside Western systems, from outside American and European systems, where there's no choice but to innovate. The founder of ALU likes to use a line: constraint drives innovation. And you see that in some parts of the world where you have no choice but to come up with a different way of doing things. And I like to think that at some point in the US, we're going to begin to see constraint driving innovation. Why don't we have an American leadership university that's like the African Leadership University, whose mission is to educate ethical and entrepreneurial leaders? Lord knows we could use it in this country. And so I think, institutions that focus on doing fewer things really well at an affordable cost, they're beginning to pop up. One of the interesting things about writing this book was finding some of them and then having some of them find me and saying, take a look at what we're doing. But I know we're about out of time, but just a last point. One of the things that impedes those institutions is our accreditation process. If you're a startup university or college trying to do something really different, it's going to take you years and a lot of hard work to get through an accreditation process that really prioritizes the traditional. And often you don't have that time because you don't have the money. So we don't have an accreditation process that really allows for a lot of innovation and experimentation right now, but you're beginning to see it. And so my hope is that we'll continue to see it.
Just a shout out to Professor Karen Belnier, who had a question about accreditation. So you two are on the same wavelength. I'm afraid this wavelength is going to have to pause right now. Brian, you've been a fantastic person to talk with. This has just been a real delight to hear from your experience, your thinking, and of course, 19th century literature is always more than welcome here. I guess one quick question to ask is, what's the best way to keep up with you, especially as you're working in Kigali?
I will confess I'm not a big social media guy. I am on LinkedIn, but anyone can always reach out to me. I have more email addresses than I can keep track of, but if you just use my Harvard email address, which is brian_rosenberg@gse.harvard.edu, I am a ridiculously frequent reader of email, and I try to respond to everybody. So that's the easiest way. If anyone's interested in learning more about ALU, just reach out. It has become a real passion of mine.
I can see that. Well, you've reached out to us very, very generously for the past hour. Thank you so much, Brian, and thank you for this book, and good luck. Good luck with ALU.
Thanks. I really appreciate it. Thanks for having me, Brian. It's been fun.
Looking forward to catching up again.
Okay.
Friends, don't go away yet. I just need to point out where things are headed going ahead. And thank you, by the way, for all of your tremendous questions. If you'd like to keep talking about this, if you'd like to keep talking about accreditation or governance or tenure on all questions of economic institutional change, you can hit us up on social media. Just use the hashtag FTTE. Here is where you can find me on Twitter, Mastodon, Threads, Blue Sky, and of course my blog. If you'd like to look into our previous sessions where we covered some of these topics, take a look at tinyurl.com/FTF-archive. If you'd like to look into our sessions coming up, just go to forum.futureofeducation.us and you can find them there. And above all, thank you for thinking with us today. It's just been a real treat to learn from you all, to hear from your perspectives. Thank you for all of these comments and all these questions. I hope you're all doing well in this increasingly chaotic year of 2023. I hope you're all safe. And we'll see you next time online. Take care. Bye-bye.